Good afternoon.
And welcome to today's briefing on the health costs and benefits of energy and energy policy decisions. I would like to thank, first off, the assistance of Senator Tom Harkin from Iowa, who both as his personal office staff as well as his staff at the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the HELP Committee, has been really helpful, and obviously he's had a strong interest in both these issues, from his leadership in healthcare and the intersection of the two. So really, it's been really great to work with him. We have Eldon Bays, energy legislative assistant, as well as Caroline Fichtenberg with the HELP Committee. Anyway, thanks all for coming. I'm really looking forward to, we have a great panel today. I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And I am going to very briefly introduce our speakers, and we will just get right into it. Today we have Dr. Jonathan Patz, who's joining us today from the University of Wisconsin, where he's a professor and director of the Global Health Program. Dr. Patz was heavily involved in the UN World Bank Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, which some of you may be familiar with. I'm sure you're all familiar with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So Dr. Patz was actually lead author as part of the IPCC proceedings, and he shares a Nobel Prize, which should not fail to mention. He's also president of the International Association on Ecology and Health. Also joining us, Dr. Kristen Welker-Hood, who's the Director of Environmental Health at the Physicians of Social Responsibility, a nonprofit organization and affiliation of health professionals here in Washington, D.C. In addition to her doctorate, though, she's also has a nursing background and was a practicing nurse treating asthma and other patients. So I think she brings both a clinical as well as a research perspective. And then finally, we have Dr. Maureen Cropper, who is not only a professor of economics at the University of Maryland, but she was vice chair of this very large National Research Council effort to examine the health, environmental, and other external costs of energy. And that's really kind of the upshot of today. We sort of know that energy has different health effects, but it's like, what do we do with it in terms of policy decision making? We're going to try and put some frames, some numbers, and some decision-making rationale around that. And so the short title for the report that they came out with in draft form late last year, but will be in final form in about a month, I understand, The Hidden Cost of Energy. And it looks at a whole range of technologies, and she'll talk more about that. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Jonathan Patz.
Jan, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really going to set the context of why we're here. We are here to talk about the costs and potential benefits from different energy scenarios. We also, of course, care about this more than we've ever cared before because of the issue of climate change that has emerged. So I want to just start with a quick snapshot reminder about what climate change means for public health for about 3 minutes, and then launch into some of the issues of energy and how energy actually costs in public health, but also there could be tremendous benefits if we were to change our energy policy. Oh, that is great. It's changed automatically, so we're good. Okay. I do want to make you aware or remind you that just last week on Thursday, there was a different National Academy of Sciences report released called Advancing the Science of Climate Change, sort of looking over the IPCC reports again and looking over the climate science. There's been a lot of debate. I'm sure you've been seeing a lot of debate all over again on climate change, but the conclusion of this recent National Academy report from last week is that climate change is occurring, is caused largely by human activity, mostly burning fossil fuels, and poses significant risk for a broad range of human and natural systems. Whoops. And just some more conclusions from this report from last week. The Earth has warmed about 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit over the last century, and this is corroborated by a variety of independent observations. It's not just that single University of East Anglia. There are many other independent observations that actually show the Earth has been warming. And most of the warming over the last several decades can be attributed to human activity, primarily burning fossil fuels. It is not explained by natural climate variability, and the projected additional warming ranges from 2 degrees to 11.5 degrees Fahrenheit over the next century. This is the latest National Academy of Sciences report. So why, me in public health, why should I care? Why do we care about climate change? So what if the Earth has more extreme hydrologic events and warmer temperatures? Well, there are a number of all sorts of things, from direct heat waves and air pollution and effects on aeroallergens like pollen, to infectious diseases, especially those that are indirectly transmitted from vectors, these vector-borne diseases, mostly insect-borne diseases. And because it's climate change, you know, global warming is a misnomer, it's climate change. It also involves not only temperature and sea level rise, but extremes of the water cycle, hydrologic extremes. So flooding and waterborne diseases, and of course droughts and problems with food supply, and storms leading to issues of mental health, refugees, and all sorts of havoc that affect public health. So that's not what we're here to talk about, but I just want to put that in context, that there is in the background, the issue is, well, if we keep burning fossil fuels as we do, we have this issue to look forward to, or not to look forward to, and there are some very significant public health issues. Obvious one, heat waves. This is what happened with that very dramatic heat wave in Europe, where over 50,000 people died in 11 days. That's a public health disaster. Again, it's not global warming. It's climate change. It's also extremes of the hydrologic cycle. Heavier floods, heavier snowstorms even. Extremes of the water cycle is at issue. And this is from the U.S. Climate Change Science Program, showing the nature of rainfall. You know, what type of rain will we have? Over here on the right, these are heavy precipitation events. In the middle, moderate, and these are light precipitation events. All of the climatologists looking at climate change, what they're projecting and forecasting is that we're going to have more very heavy rainfall events. When it rains, it's really going to rain very hard. And we already know in Washington, when it rains hard, we have contaminated water. We have these combined sewage overflow events. And this is what following a heavy rainfall and runoff looks like in the Milwaukee Harbor. You can see all that turbidity after a big rainstorm. And guess what's in that stuff? Well, all of the bright red and the red flaming hot blue indicates E. coli counts. And you can see all this E. coli in the water and on the beaches here, too, in Milwaukee after a heavy rainfall event. So, you know, climate change is about temperature, but it's also about extremes of the water cycle. So we're here to talk about energy. And, of course, you know, backing up, you know, climate change is from the National Academy now, yet again, concludes that it's based primarily on human activity burning fossil fuels. And so if we were to just think for a minute, what if climate change doesn't happen? Let's say climate, okay, all those things I just showed you, we're not going to worry about them, even though I think they're very significant. Let's pretend climate change is not an issue. Let's focus on the root issue of how we deal with energy. And I'm not going to go into depth too much here because the next speaker is going to be going into depth on the public health effects. But coal, for example, not only has health effects but environmental effects. You know, more than 700 miles of streams have been filled from toxic mountaintop coal mining operations. There are definitely occupational health hazards from coal miners, and air pollution. Lots of air pollutants that are hazardous to our health. And Kristen, our next speaker, will show you why. But lots of air pollution from coal, including mercury. which is toxic to the brain. Now, if we were to switch to natural gas, well, natural gas, there are also occupational hazards, and some of the chemicals used for cracking the rock called fracking, there are lots of chemicals there. But air pollution, we've got less of an air pollution issue with natural gas compared to coal. And all those other, the SO2 and particulate matter and mercury, that's not a problem with burning natural gas. We still have nitrogen oxides and CO2, about half as much CO2 released compared to coal. So natural gas is incrementally better than coal, but still has some problems. Nuclear, well, nuclear has all sorts of issues as far as mining uranium, and you have radon and uranium tailings and occupational issues. The main issue with nuclear, of course, is waste storage and potential for nuclear proliferation, not to mention the exorbitant costs and time delays that it takes to get a nuclear power plant online, which would probably steal a lot of money away from renewable energy research and resources. So, you know, nuclear has possibly a small role, but you know, there's some trade-offs there. So I want to finally shift into some of the oil and gas related issues of energy and health, and I want to just put a caveat here as we think about new energy sources. So there's a lot of talk about corn-based ethanol and biofuels in general. There is a question of making fuels from food staples like corn, and could that affect global food security? It's really it's an open question. It's not really known. Like the cost of the Mexican corn tortillas that skyrocketed. I've heard a lot of economists and people in the food world say, well, it probably wasn't related to corn ethanol, but there are these questions about food-based crops for fuel. Could it affect food security? And Maureen Cropper is going to talk about her the National Academy report on hidden cost of energy, where they really looked at the life cycle assessment, life cycle analysis to, you know, cradle to grave type of analysis to say, what does this all cost? And that's, I want to show you one example. When you look at corn-based ethanol, are we really looking at a total life cycle analysis? This is a graph showing how the corn production for ethanol has been increasing over time. So we have quite a lot of corn-based ethanol in production right now. If you were to burn a gallon of gasoline side by side with a gallon of corn ethanol, which do you think would be cleaner? Just burning it. What would be cleaner, the ethanol or the gasoline? Ethanol. You burn that gallon of ethanol, it's cleaner, until you look at the full life cycle assessment. And Dr. Jason Hill has done this at the University of Minnesota, and he found that the diesel and fertilizer that goes into produce the corn to make the ethanol results in more particulate air pollution, the small PM 2.5, which is very hazardous to our lungs. It makes, you know, the full life cycle, you get more of that than burning the equivalent amount of gasoline. So when we look at these different alternatives, we need to be looking from cradle to grave, full life cycle assessment, and try to avoid these unintentional consequences. So I want to give you some good news, because as we get further into the nasty health effects of burning fossil fuels, especially burning coal that Kristen's going to talk about, and then we talk about the tremendous costs that Dr. Cropper will be talking about, I want to just let you know that there is some great news if we were to reduce burning fossil fuels. Great news for public health. This is a study that was done by colleagues of mine at the University of Wisconsin, Dr. Greg Nemeth, who's a energy policy expert, where they looked at the cost and benefits of reducing CO2. And if you focus on these numbers, what they've looked at a broad range of studies that looked at the health benefits of reducing tons of CO2. You reduce CO2, you reduce all the other air pollutants. You know, you burn oil or coal, you know, CO2 production, but also particulate air pollution, nitrogen oxides, and other air pollutants. By reducing 1 ton of CO2, the average, and there's a wide range, but the average across studies shows a health benefit of $49 per ton of CO2. A health benefit of about $50 per ton. That is not in discussion here in Washington. The only thing in discussion is at the bottom. Do we want to pay up to $30 per ton of mitigated CO2? So all the discussion is, should we pay $10, $15, up to $30 per ton? And not in the discussion is, well, what about the health co-benefits of getting that pollution out of the air? That's, I think $50 is greater than $30. Am I correct? Anyway, that's not in the discussion, and it really needs to be. So what are these great opportunities if we were to mitigate greenhouse gases, reduce CO2? Well, we know that people die from air pollution. According to the World Health Organization, about 1 million people die every year prematurely from air pollution. And also, about 2 million people die every year from unhealthy lifestyles because they are physically inactive, because we have built cities for cars and not for people. So here, if we were to change our lifestyle, get away from the automobile, clean up air pollution, and have more exercise opportunities, we could save a lot of lives. So what's wrong with this picture? If you're in a wheelchair, you don't take an escalator, by the way. We have designed cities like we've designed this fitness center. They just don't make sense. Think about our greatest public health challenge today in the United States. According to the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, obesity is our #1 epidemic. We, on average, are 17 pounds heavier than we were 30 years ago. 15% of children are overweight. 7% of the population has diabetes. And 60% of Americans do not meet the minimum recommended level of exercise. What's more, 40% of car trips are less than 2 miles. Now, unless you live in Washington, D.C., where you have a great transportation system, or at least pretty good anyway, you know, most of our American cities have been designed around the automobile. We have these beltways, and it's hard to get in. So, but look how many trips are really short. Those could be done without a car. Let's look at the leading causes of death in the United States. Everything circled, which is most of them, are related to either air pollution, sedentary lifestyle, or motor vehicle crashes. So if we were to get away from the automobile, we could have a huge impact on reducing the leading causes of death in our country. And this is why, if you look at transportation, if we could solve the transportation problem, which is 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions, we would potentially have enhanced personal fitness, reduced air pollution, and reduced greenhouse gases. And this is why, as a public health scientist, I firmly believe that climate change mitigation could be the greatest public health opportunity that we've had in over a century. Here's some numbers from my city of Madison, Wisconsin, where the average commute is about 3 miles. And if you were to ride a bike, you would expend some calories, and you'd have weight loss till you got your ideal weight. And that level of exercise, 200 minutes per week, would reduce the risk of heart disease by 1/2, stroke by 1/3, breast cancer by 1/3, colon cancer by 40%, diabetes by 30%. Physical activity is incredible as far as being health promoting. And I argue that, again, that that this is a place where if we were to green our transportation and get away from the automobile, we could have tremendous health savings from personal fitness. And this syncs perfectly with the new recommendations for physical activity, which are 30 to 60 minutes of moderate activity every day. So this is where there could be some great opportunities. Now, let's look at the second benefit. The first is fitness. What about air pollution? And a lot of the next speakers are going to, a lot of what they're going to talk about is the air pollution issue. Well, thinking about the current administration's National Rail Plan, I think this is a good idea as far as public health. When you think about trucking is 66% of our shipping, and on-road vehicles emit almost half of man-made nitrogen oxides, and PM is a huge issue. In fact, diesel trucks are considered the #1 source of health-damaging air pollution in the Midwest. So if we were to have a decent national rail system, we could remove cars, trucks, and that could clean up the air. Can we quantify this? How much benefit are we talking about when we take these vehicles off the road? Well, we had a great natural experiment during the Olympics of 1996 in Atlanta. Well, they were smart. They said, look, we've got these Olympics here. We need to clean up the air. Let's mandate, let's avoid traffic. They decreased traffic by 23%. They found that ground level smog ozone, the bad ozone, not the good stuff, but the bad ground level ozone, decreased by 28%. What happened? Asthma-related emergency room visits fell by 42%. And it wasn't just because less people were driving. Look at the bottom. They have a nice control. Emergency visits for non-asthma did not change. So you reduce the traffic, you change the air quality, you get a response, a positive health response of 42% less asthma. So we have taken this to look at the Midwest region. We're looking at the 11 largest cities in the Midwest, and according to the National Personal Transportation Survey, lots of the trips out there are short car trips, less than 5 miles, 4 to 8 kilometers, which is 20% of VMT, vehicle miles traveled. If we were to eliminate those short car trips, what would that mean for air quality? And we've used the EPA BenMaps model, benefit mapping for benefits, and we basically, by a census tract level, look at modeled air pollution over demographics in that census and come up with estimates. What do we find? If we were to take 20% of the car trips off the road in the Midwest, we would save hundreds of lives, actually hundreds of thousands of hospitalizations avoided, and billions of healthcare dollars saved simply from reduced air pollution. And that number would double if you add the fitness benefit, if you were to turn those non-car trips into active transport. So I'm going to wrap up by saying that there are some tremendous benefits if we were to change our energy. Right now the debates are on costs, on how much should we spend on changing our energy, and I think we really need to also bring into the equation and the discussion the potential health benefits for cleaner air quality, and I think they're tremendous. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Patz. And I'd like to bring up Dr. Kristen Welker-Hood, again, the Director of Environmental Health for the Physicians for Social Responsibility. And for those who came late, as well as a researcher and an active spokesperson on this, she's also been a practicing nurse. So I'm very much looking forward to your comments.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was told not to scare you too much. When I get to talk about coal pollution, I typically get to say I'm the Debbie Downer of looking at electricity. But you'll see on the front slide here, this is a report that's right outside the door. We released this report back in November. It's called Coal's Assault on Human Health. Some of you might have even seen us speak about this at another briefing that Senator Menendez had co-sponsored. So what I would like to talk to you about is the health effects that have been associated with coal, because that's a significant part of our contribution to both generating electricity as well as significantly contributes to air pollutants. And so energy is very important to us. I mean, we use a lot of energy. We generate a lot of energy, up to about 4 million gigawatt hours a year. And we've seen some increases from 2006, although it's starting to lag off a bit during our terrible recession. But we do use a lot of electricity. Now, I started off saying that electricity is really important. I can tell you as a nurse, I used to take care of patients in hospitals that are extremely energy intensive. We need electricity. In places in the world that doesn't have electricity, they suffer from not having electricity. Our message isn't that electricity is bad. Our message is, how are we creating electricity so that it doesn't have negative health implications related to it? Now, about 48% of U.S. electricity is from burning coal, and the pollution of coal-fired power plants contributes to 49,000 deaths and 450,000 serious illnesses a year. The external costs, and this is something that Maureen is going to talk about, is about $16 billion per year. Now, how do we get to that number? She's going to tell you. But a lot of it is the costs that we don't pay for when we pay for our kilowatt per hour. It's not, it's the health costs, it's the medication costs, it's those things. So I think that it's really important to know that when you pay your electric bill, you're not paying the cost that is put out to society and to families who have children who suffer from asthma. This is a pie graph that shows where our electricity is coming from. About half is coming from coal, followed by natural gas and nuclear. The coal is, based on its molecular structure, is about 2 times more carbon than natural gas. And this has significant impacts to carbon emissions. So why is that so critically important? Because we always think about coal for conventional pollutants that we manage under the Clean Air Act and have really saved a lot of lives under the Clean Air Act. It's one of our biggest public health success stories. But the important thing also to note is that when you think of coal and you're burning coal, think of climate change, because the two are inextricably connected. Coal, when we think about coal, don't only think about combustion. You need to think about the entire life cycle of coal, from extraction to waste. Now, some of these pictures that you'll see, blowing up sides of mountains, mountaintop removal, and in here also kind of surface mining, where you're tearing away the surface of the earth to get to those coal seams. And that results in water pollution, significant water pollution, and a decrease in water quality. Then you'll see that we have combustion, which is a lot of, coal is a rock. And in that rock, it has lots of different things in it. For example, heavy metals that are released that would not have been released if they weren't combusted, right? So you'll see coming from the stacks a lot of various different pollutants. The dark part of the stack is probably particulate matter, but what is invisible that's also coming out of that stack is CO2. And then you'll have a lovely picture of the Tennessee Valley where there was a coal ash release. And this is something that is of particular importance because it releases hazardous pollutants into our water system and is linked with cancer in children. And so it's throughout the entire life cycle, it's pretty impressive, its impact on human health. And while I don't have a picture of a miner here, we know just a month ago we had a tragic accident, and while it is terrible to see so many, young men dying in the coal mines, what that doesn't capture is those who are continuing to die of black lung disease in the United States. It has not gone away. And in fact, NIOSH has said that they've been seeing increased rates of black lung from coal mining. So let's talk a little bit about respiratory effects. I'm going to talk to you today about respiratory effects, cardiovascular effects, and neurologic effects. What you'll see in our coal's assault on human health, that really coal pollutants hit every major organ system in your body. And in fact, it contributes to 4 of the leading causes of death. Dr. Patz had a slide up there. It contributes to heart attacks, strokes, chronic lower respiratory diseases, and cancer. Well, I noticed when I looked at that, it also other leading causes of death, the 6th and the 7th, was Alzheimer's and diabetes, major killers. I'll let you know, one thing that I hope you walk away from today is understanding what that underlying mechanism is that is impacting all these organ systems. And the major mechanism is inflammation. Now, if you get a cut on your skin and you get it all red and it becomes infected, you know what inflammation is, right? That's a typical infection. Now, inflammation inside your body, systemic inflammation that you'll see doctors talk a lot about, is kind of those same inflammatory mediators are happening through the body and, in fact, impacting your heart and your lungs and even your brain. And so Alzheimer's and diabetes, which have been linked to inflammatory process, the underlying, this is really the novel science in medicine, is that some of the leading chronic diseases in our country are related to inflammatory process. And that's why these pollutants that stimulate inflammation in the body have been linked to so many of these conditions in so many different organ systems. So here are some of the pollutants of notice. A few of them are actually our critical pollutants, SOx, NOx, and PM, and they have pretty significant impacts. I have to race through because it tells you exactly what they're doing. Coal pollutants are irritants, and basically they impact the lungs in a variety of ways. NOx and PM, they affect the lung development by reducing forced expiratory volume. It's an indicator, actually, of lung function. It also triggers asthma attacks. Now, if you see this airway, you'll see a nice healthy airway, nice and open, you could breathe through it. The other is very narrow, think like a straw. So if you have a garden hose versus a straw, that's what it's like being an asthmatic. You're breathing through the straw. And these pollutants actually cause this constant swelling up in the airway that make it so difficult to breathe. And it also causes chronic obstructive pulmonary disease like emphysema to have permanent airway narrowing. So what kind of particles are we talking about? You hear us talk about particulate matter a lot, PM 2.5 being the one that we pay attention to, but PM 10 is another one we care a lot about. Why do we care about PM 2.5? Because it's really small. And because it's so small, it can lodge and travel through the airway down to the bottom part of your lungs. Ozone is similar that way, too. It gets real low into the lungs and affects the place in your lungs, the alveoli, where you are exchanging gases. And this is why it is so incredibly important that we really control the number of particulates that are getting out into the airway. A lot of particulates are coming from coal. So pollutants from coal combustion, it's been linked to asthma, COPD, and lung cancer. And this is the map of asthma in the country. 22 million people have asthma in our country. 6 million of them are children. The CDC has reported an 84% increase since 1980, and half the states have asthma rates about 8.6%. The highest rates are clustered in the Northeast. That is by no mistake, because that is where some of our worst pollutants are, and also where we have the clustering of coal plants in this country. So cardiovascular effects. Let me tell you what the take-home message of this is. You'll hear that particulate matter is impacting your affects you through arrhythmias and through heart attacks. Well, it's really through that inflammatory process that's happening, and it's impacting both the rhythm and the swelling within the heart. This is a slide about a study that had demonstrated that hospital admissions in a very large Medicare data set of about 11 million people had an increase of 1% of coronary congestive heart failure, for each increase in 10 micrograms per cubic meter concentration. Now that seems like a really minute amount of increase, but if you extrapolate that over 11 million people in Medicare, what you really get is a translation in large effects with hospital admissions, illnesses, death, costs to health care, and lost opportunity costs. So air pollution, there's been several studies on air pollution. I think that the important thing here is that all of these pollutants, whether it's nitrous oxides, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, PM, they're all contributing to stroke. Now, stroke is linked here in the cardiovascular section. People go, well, that's happening in my brain. Why are you putting it there? The thing to know about stroke is it's a vascular issue. It has to do with occlusion that keeps the blood from flowing and the oxygen. Your brain needs a lot of oxygen to function. It blocks that air from getting to the tissue, causes tissue death, stroke, and it's really a vascular issue. So these three studies have demonstrated a risk in stroke that even, so it's increased risk of stroke both in women and in the Medicare study, and even with lag time. So pollution might be bad one day, but 3 days later, for example, you'll see some impacts with certain pollutants there. Sorry, I'm racing through. Now, I wanted to I mentioned to you the neurologic effects. I'm going to focus on one of the hazardous air pollutants because we often talk about conventional air pollutants, and I've been talking a lot about it's ischemia, and I think that that's really important because these pollutants cause inflammation in the vessels. It causes plaques building up in those vessels, which also prevents the blood from flowing. It changes how thick your blood is. So that's how we have been seeing its association with things like diabetes and its association with things like with Alzheimer's, which is often a plaque and an inflammation. I hear you. But the thing that we often, what is overlooked in that process is the direct effects of a neurotoxin called mercury. And mercury is able to move through the system. It's burnt, goes up through the stacks, settles out into water, gets into fish, bioaccumulates in fish. The bigger fish we like to eat, and we take that in. It deposits in fatty tissue, and it becomes a methylated form, which is a neurotoxin and attacks the nervous system. There's a majority of mercury released in the environment comes from human activity, and EPA estimates that the annual amount of mercury in the atmosphere from human activity is as high as 75%. And this data is from the EPA mercury study, shows the breakdown of human activity or anthropogenic sources, and as you can see that the majority really from utilities and then industrial boilers, which are burning coal. So the majority of this, about 50% of this mercury is coming from the burning of coal. So mercury health effects, like I said, it's a neurotoxin. It can be related to high levels, can be related to retardation, brain development, impaired hearing and coordination, mental disturbances. And this is a really important study that also came out of the EPA in which it found that cord blood had 70% higher in maternal levels. And from 99 to 2000, about 15% of women with childbearing age had mercury levels of about 3.5. That translates into about 5 micrograms per liter in the fetus. who is born, and that's enough to actually relate to having mental disabilities. And so 63,000 children were born annually in the year at risk because of that exposure. That means a lot because it is essentially a dumbing down of our population. Even that small amount makes those who are at the brightest range shift down, much like we see with lead. And I'm not going to really talk about global warming. Dr. Patz did a good job there, but I can touch on some of those points during our Q&A, and there's a whole section in our executive summary here. And if you wanted the full report that explains all the things I just discussed with you, it's www.psr.org. Thank you.
Okay, that was sobering. You did warn us of that, but I think it's important now to say this, that we try and deal with these things deliberately, and that's what we're going to try and do in this session overall. And so finally, I have Dr. Maureen Cropper, again, professor of the Department of Economics at the University of Maryland. I'm going to talk about the National Research Council report, of which she's been heavily involved with, and very much looking to your comments as well.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm actually going to talk about just a very small part of this report today, basically the health damages from air pollution associated with electricity generation and transportation. Let's make sure I've done that. Okay. Our study was requested in the Energy Policy Act of 2005. The money came in 2008. We actually started this study in September of 2008 and finished it in September of 2009. So it was not a lot of time. The parts I'm going to talk to you about were the parts that were done most thoroughly. What we were asked to do was to actually, as it says here, evaluate the external costs and benefits, although I must say we focused on the costs related to energy production, distribution, and use. And I'll be focusing primarily on health costs today. I won't go through who was on the committee. Jerry Cohen, president of CMU, was the chair. I was the vice chair. We had epidemiologists and toxicologists on the committee. We also had quite a few economists, including Richard Newell, who's now at EIA. You can, again, look through this another time. And I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there were more parts to this study that I'm going to talk about today. The third bullet is important. We did look at the air pollution effects when we looked at non-climate damages. So we didn't look, for example, at the water pollution associated with mining, issues that the two previous speakers have brought up. So these are not things that I'm going to tell you about today. We did calculate damages and monetize them for 2005 and also for 2030. And I won't go into the last bullet because I'm just going to talk about the local air pollution effects. Okay, so to give you an idea of what we did, in the case of power plants, coal-fired power plants, of which there are approximately 400, we looked at the emissions of each plant. So here's a plant somewhere in Ohio that may be putting out possibly 50,000 tons of SO2 a year. We figured out the impact of that plant on ambient air quality, okay, the impacts on particulate matter of the SO2. Compared to having no plant, this is important. The baseline here is 0, okay? So we looked at the impact of those emissions on ambient air quality, and this was throughout the U.S. I won't go into how this was modeled. We looked at the exposed population. We estimated, and the exposed population does include crops and trees as well as humans, although most of these impacts are going to be human health effects. We calculated impacts and monetize them. As it says in the second bullet, we did consider other effects that are often considered in EPA regulatory impact analyses, like impacts on field crops of ozone and impact on timber yields from ozone, impacts on visibility, and so forth. But the bottom line here in terms of the damages, the monetary damages, are health damages. And as you look at the last bullet here, 94% of these monetized damages that you're going to see are due to premature mortality. We used a $6 million value of a statistical life. which is what is used by the U.S. EPA, but it's also the result of other meta-analyses, and this is in $2,000. Okay, so this is an important thing, as I say, to note here. Okay, in the case of coal, this was a bottom-up analysis, plant by plant. Why did we do it this way? The total damages here are $62 billion, as Kristen mentioned a few minutes ago. But the important thing here is really the distribution of the damages across plants. So if you order the 400 plants from the cleanest to the dirtiest, the bottom 200, the cleanest 200, are accounting for about 12% of these damages. They're also generating about 25% of the electricity that all of the plants together generate. But if you look at the dirtiest 40 plants, the top 10% there, they are generating over 40% of the damages. They're also generating the same amount of electricity as the cleanest 200 plants. So this distribution here is very skewed. These are damages based on emissions in the year 2005. You might think, okay, well, the plants that generate the most damages are the ones that generate the most electricity, but only about 30% of the variation in total damages across plants comes from variation in kilowatt hours produced. When you put this on a per kilowatt hour basis, so we're controlling for that, there is on average 3.2 cents per kilowatt hour in damages, but the range again is huge to reflect, which is a reflection actually of what I said before, going from, you know, 1/5 of a cent to 12 cents or over 12 cents. Most of this variation is due to variations in the amount of the number of pounds of NOx that are coming out per megawatt hour or pounds of SO2. It's due a little bit to where the plants are located also, because plants that are closer to population centers generate, you know, more damages, but most of this is due to variation in pollution intensity. And we did look at what would happen in 2030 based on EIA estimates of pollution intensity, assuming effectively that the provisions of CARE would go into effect, and so the amount goes down. I'm not going to focus, though, on the 2030 estimates. This map shows you where the dirtiest plants are. The size of the circle is proportional to the damage, and mirroring again what Kristen said in terms of where dirty coal plants are, and I'm sure most of you knew this already, but a picture is worth 1,000 words in terms of showing you where the high damage plants are. Also, I should say before I leave this slide, because John Levy from the Harvard School of Public Health could not be here today, the estimates that we have, that I'm presenting to you here, are actually, how shall I say it, conservative. I can't explain all of that, but John's estimates are higher. Different dose response function was used and so forth, but in any case, these are conservative estimates. In terms of natural gas, we also did bottom-up analysis. We didn't do every plant for reasons I won't go into, but we did plants that accounted for 71% of the electricity generated from gas. The damages here are about 740 million. So if you gross it up to all the plants, it would be about $1 billion compared to the 62 billion. Of course, less electricity is being generated from natural gas. But the things here, I think, to really focus on, if you look at the average damages per kilowatt hour, which are, you know, 1/6 of a cent, a megawatt hour generated by gas is generating damages of about $1.60. As you saw from the previous slide, it's $32 from coal. So it's about 20 times as high on a per kilowatt hour basis. So I think that's the takeaway message here. There's also skewness in the distribution of, you know, the dirty plants generating a high percentage of the damages, but, you know, we know that natural gas is cleaner, and this attempts to tell us exactly how much cleaner. Okay. The gas plants we won't focus on too much, but again, we have a damage map for damages from natural gas plants. Okay. We really didn't go into detail in looking at health risks associated with nuclear power or wind and solar power in terms of the criteria pollutants that we examined for coal and gas. In routine operation, these are going to be small for these plants. Okay. In the case of transportation, the emphasis was, as it says here, on highway vehicles, on cars and trucks, as opposed to rail or marine sources and so forth. And the important thing here is the last bullet. We looked at a life cycle analysis, and that's extremely important, as Jonathan Patz told you a few minutes ago. You get a very different picture when you look at the emissions, and again, these are the local air pollution emissions, the criteria pollutant emissions from all sources, not just the tailpipe emissions in number 4 there, but when you look at what's being generated when the vehicle is built and also when fuel is being extracted and refined. Okay, so this is going to be the takeaway message here. Again, in terms of aggregate damages, we do have aggregate figures for the year 2005, again, about approximately $60 billion, with the breakdown here between light and heavy-duty vehicles. We can look at these damages on a per-gallon basis, but we emphasize them in terms of their cost per mile traveled. Okay, and I'll explain why when we get to the last few slides here. But yeah, these are varying from 1.2 to 1.7 cents. But the important thing, I think, is how they vary across different parts of the life cycle. I know you can't see this diagram. If you go to the study on the web, it's not out in hard copy form, but you go to the study on the web, you can blow this picture up with, your Acrobat reader so you can see it. But let me just, let's see, is there a pointer on this that I can use? Ah, yes, okay. Okay, the two things you should focus on, first of all, the damages on the left are the damages per mile in 2005, and 2030 damages are on the right. The bottom dark blue parts are the tailpipe emissions from each of the different technologies or fuel technologies here. So the last one is diesel. You can't read it, but that's diesel. So if for diesel, you have a fairly, well, it looks like about a third of the emissions coming from tailpipe. For electric vehicles, grid-dependent electric vehicles, you have almost, nothing coming out of the tailpipe. Okay. The important thing here is that what you're getting from vehicle manufacturing, which is the top part, is about a third of the total life cycle cost. So manufacturing emissions are important. That's one takeaway message. The other is if you compare the electric vehicle damage, which is this bar here, with biofuel produced from wet corn, okay, which is this bar here, those are the two highest bars. Conventional gasoline vehicles are the first two. And so what you have here is the fact that as long as we're generating the electricity for electric vehicles from the power plants you saw in the previous part of the presentation, you're going to have high damages per mile. And in fact, we figured out that you would have to generate about 2/3 of our electricity from renewables for the bar associated with electric vehicles here to be as low as the gasoline bar. So that's something people don't think about. It does bear thinking about. Given my time, I think I probably won't focus too much more on this slide, except that what happens here, the damages look and are estimated to be lower per mile traveled in 2030. This is partly the result of CAFE standards and partly the result of EPA regulations fully being implemented in the vehicle fleet, like the heavy-duty engine diesel rule and Tier 2 emission standards. Okay, what should these numbers be used for? We actually, even though we don't do policy in the study, I think it's important to talk about what they should and shouldn't be used for. So, okay, these damages, if you reduced emissions, or rather if you reduced emissions, they would be benefits. So they give you some idea of the benefits of pollution control, but you do need to compare this with the costs of control, which indeed we didn't do in the study. We didn't look at the costs of putting a scrubber on some of the dirtiest power plants. In terms of how you would want to control pollution, actually when this study first came out, somebody asked me at a briefing here what was my worst fear about how the study results would be used, and I said people would say you should have a 3.2 cent per kilowatt hour tax on electricity, and I said no, that would be awful, in the sense that if you're concerned about these pollution damages, and that's really what we're measuring here, you've got to do something to provide an incentive to reduce pollution, so either in the form of taxes or allowances for SO2 or even command and control. You want something that's actually going to actually get at the pollution, and a tax on electricity doesn't really provide you with an incentive to reduce SO2 per se. Same thing with a tax on gasoline. It will reduce miles traveled, but doesn't produce an incentive to reduce the emissions per mile. So we could use these estimates to look at benefits. And by the way, the data for this study, all of the data underlying the study is on the web now, and so even though the baseline here for a given power plant is 0 emissions, you could actually figure out the benefits of reducing, so many tons of SO2 from the information on the web. What else can these results be used for? Okay, if you're thinking about the choice across fuel sources, natural gas versus coal versus nuclear, the appropriate way here would be to compare the cost per kilowatt hour, including the health costs and other externalities, CO2 damages, which we're not really quantifying and talking about here. But you also would have to, of course, look at the costs just of the operating and capital costs of the plant. And again, we don't do that in this study, so we give part of the picture but not all of it. And of course, it's only fair to say that the newest coal plants of the 406 have very low damages. Okay. Same thing with selecting across different transportation technologies. It would be appropriate to add health costs and other externalities, CO2 damages, to capital and fuel costs, choosing across different technologies. Finally, to end on a point that Jonathan Patz raised, which is, okay, we're looking at reducing greenhouse gases, and let's say it costs us $30 to reduce a ton of CO2. Maybe we're doing that by improving energy efficiency even further in appliance usage, just to use an example. What do the numbers we're looking at here say about how does this fit into the analysis? Okay, suppose, oh sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Suppose that some energy saving technology does reduce electricity use by 1 megawatt hour, which would reduce CO2 by about a ton, okay? Then, well, if that electricity was produced by a coal plant, you would save a ton of CO2, okay? And the question is, okay, that's going to cost something depending on what the appliances cost to be more energy efficient and so forth. What are the co-benefits in terms of health from reducing that ton of CO2 by reducing a megawatt hour of electricity from a coal plant? Well, if the damages are, as they are on average, about $30 per megawatt hour, that's what you saw on a previous slide, that would be the co-benefits from reducing that ton of CO2. Jonathan showed us a slide where the benefits varied significantly across studies and countries and so forth, but just to tie it into what they are in this study, on average it's about $30 if that megawatt hour was generated from coal. If it was generated from gas or other sources, then of course the co-benefits would be lower. But the point is, these co-benefits are there and you should add them in or use them to offset the cost of reducing the ton of CO2 from electricity generation. Okay, so I just wanted to answer the question Janet asked me to answer in the presentation, which is really, how should these numbers be used? So I will stop at this point because I think I've used up my 15 minutes.
Thanks very much, and hopefully if you have any other, if there's something key that you missed there. And thank you for reminding me that Jonathan Levy from the School of Public Health at Harvard University wanted to be here, was hoping until the last minute to be here, but he's in the process of adopting a baby, and baby was, I guess, on the way, so he had to stay closer to home. I know I had lots of thoughts and questions listening to you all, and it's a big issue. But rather than I can save my questions, I really would like to invite folks from the audience to please just stand up, say who you are, and fire away.
The question is, the EPA recently released some proposed rules for emissions standards for future plants and other installations. Are those standards, in your opinion, protective of human health? Are they adequate?
Okay, so just for the purposes of our video recording, the question was about the proposed rules from EPA about regulations for new plants, existing plants, question if they're adequate. And in fairness, they may or not be. Say what you know.
Sure, I'd be happy to say what I know. So I think that you may be thinking about the ozone standard. Is that?
Well, it was a proposed rule in two parts. One for boilers, and that standard is sometimes referred to as the MAC standard. And then they also are for commercial industrial solid waste facilities, or the so-called CIS, however you say the acronym.
Yeah.
They're big, and I realize that they're new, and so you're not going to be able to...
Those aren't the proposed rules that I've been paying all that much attention to. I mean, when the EPA has also come out with a lot of proposed rules of late in this administration, particularly they're getting ready to finalize the one on ozone. They've also done one on SOx. The one on ozone is actually quite good. And yes, the answer would be yes on health protective, because during the Bush administration, when they had come out with one where it was 0.075 for PM in an 8-hour, it was, I believe that.
You meant to say ozone.
Yeah, for ozone standard. Did I say PM? I'm sorry. For ozone, it was actually violated what the science committee had recommended. The new proposed rule, which would be a significant cut at 0.6, is going to be what the science committee actually recommended. So for ozone, yes, we have seen improvements also for SOx as well, and they've been decreasing the 8-hour, and often the SOx has been for 1 hour peak, but if you extrapolate it over an 8-hour period, it wasn't health protective. The new one is. I do not know about those two proposed rules that you're mentioning. I would love to look more deeply into it.
Sure.
Yeah.
They have a number of 0.008 pounds per million BTU per week. Is that getting towards where you'd like to see that, or again, is that too soon?
I'm sorry. I wouldn't know the correct answer. Thank you. But call me. We'll talk about it.
And thanks for raising that. Sir.
Lots of benefits and lots of ways to improve the situation. I don't know anybody that's looking collectively at how the message is getting out to the audience, one of which is 2 blocks away, and the other is just the American consumer. Is anybody systematically looking and saying, you hear about cost, okay, look at this. There are things that we can do. Most of the message that I hear is a negative message. That air pollution is bad for you, this and that. And I was at a session at the World Bank, and there was something that they were giving an award to journalists. And one of the person got up and said, she got an award, that the public gets tired of hearing negative messages. Even if they're true, they may want to turn them off. So even if the things that we're talking about in pollution is important and true, if it's going to the audience and they're shutting it off, But imagine a senator getting up and saying it's going to cost too much, and you can come up and say, hey, we're going to save you $16. If you don't spend $30, it's going to cost you $46. We're proposing, that's a different message.
Great point. So the question about how we communicate these issues and being aware of it, of not overwhelming people with negative information.
Jim, I think that's a great point, and I think it's true, which is one reason why I try to show some of the benefits and opportunities. I think we're in the same place where we were back when we had the Clean Air Act. In 1970, there was a lot of concern about the cost of putting scrubbers on smokestacks, and the cost, we just can't afford it. And then 20 years later, Congress mandated a cost-benefit assessment to be done of the Clean Air Act, and the results were, for every $1 of cost put into the cleaning our air, we received $44 in benefits. And I think that, that same message, can be echoed now to say, there are huge benefits. I mean, right now, I guess in the Gulf Coast, there's some huge benefits of not drilling for oil. That's pretty obvious. But I think that if we understood that we're not just taking away by reducing oil and forcing people to shift away from fossil fuels, that there are tremendous benefits as far as healthier cities, healthier urban designs, happier places to live. There's more and more literature on, the built environment, social capital, multimodal transportation. I think people want to be there, and I think we simply need to have a free market and sort of meet people's demands for that type of lifestyle. If we had an open free market where there was complete information of total, a full life cycle, how much did it cost to make this glass of water? Cost energy to purify the water. Where did that plastic come from? If we knew, if consumers knew what the full life cycle costs were, I think we'd be more responsible. And also, if we were to have a free market and not have subsidies that sort of shift things away from what they should be, like we subsidize coal and we subsidize oil, I think things could be better off.
Okay, thank you for that question.
In terms of making the argument for societal benefits for renewables, something benefits, and particularly distributed generation and not huge solar plants or whatever. You said that, Maureen, you said that you didn't evaluate the costs of wind and solar generation, and I suppose they have to break it down to rooftop versus concentrated solar, et cetera. But is there, I'm involved in a project, a municipal project, that's come up against the problem of justifying investment in small-scale renewable incentives because of the indirect nature of the societal benefit cost. So what we provide today is really helpful. But I just wonder in terms of renewable generation and small scale.
So is there any way, when you talk about some of the things that your report didn't get at, is there ways of thinking of breaking apart the issue of scale?
Well, you're right. We didn't consider renewables. But, I mean, if you were making, let's say, the choice between, say, clean coal and renewable energy sources going forward, and I must say, with regard to the air pollution effects, I mean, newer plants are cleaner, so you wouldn't be costing them out at $30 per megawatt hour. Another big part of this, which we did touch on in this study, but we didn't quite bite the bullet and name a number, was really what are the damages per ton of CO2, the global damages per ton of CO2. And we tried to point out there how, depending on how you thought world GDP would fall as temperature rose, and also depending on what discount rate that you thought was appropriate, you would find costs that were somewhere between $10 and $100 per ton, and well, you get, under certain reasonable assumptions, you get like $30 a ton. So, I mean, you would really want to compare these external costs, which you are bearing with the coal, I mean, plus the costs per installed capacity, unit of installed capacity, to what's happening, and transmission as well, with the case of renewables. And unfortunately, I mean, one thing we didn't look into here was really the cost side in terms of the cost of production side, because that's a big part of the story going forth in terms of the choice among different technologies. So I don't feel like I can, I should say it, directly answer this, except to say that when you're making the choice between renewables and even clean coal, you do have to look for residual costs in terms of health costs, and then also the CO2 costs, and those are things that people should be taking into account.
And I think there's some other work by folks. It's not just the total costs, but also where those, because you're talking about a very local effort, and it's where those costs are expended and who's paying the money, who's getting the money, and how those dollars are recycled. So you can maybe put a value on, I'm willing to pay this to get a certain amount of long-term price stability and keep those dollars local. ACEEE, the American Council for Energy Efficient Economy, has done some interesting work on that. Other questions? Jeremy?
I'm Jeremy Coolidge. I wear a lot of different hats, but I'm here because I'm working on an analysis where this would be a very helpful one of my variables to calculate. So my question is for Mr. Pat. Looking at the analysis, you pointed out that estimated the cost of carbon, the cost per ton of carbon emissions at $49. I wanted to know, what does that and doesn't.
Okay, the simple question, the simple answer to your question is I can give you Dr. Greg Nemet's contact. He's the lead on that. He basically looked at meta-analysis on health co-benefits from reducing CO2, and he looked at studies across the globe, including the Stern report from the UK. Any report that mentioned a health co-benefit from reducing CO2 emissions. As far as the details, I would defer you to Dr. Nemet on that, but basically he looked at all meta-analyses that have been conducted, and as Maureen pointed out, there's tremendous variability. It went from $2 to $196 per ton, so wide range of variability, but it was looking at meta-analyses that had included a health component.
I guess this might just be one time for me to inject a little bit of my question. I mean, so Doctor, you said variability in Dr. Levy's study. I'm not sure if you mentioned this, but so you came up with an average roughly 3.2 kilowatt hours. You yourself called it on the conservative side, using different dose response and a few other assumptions. His value was closer to 14 cents a kilowatt hour. So, I mean, a factor of 4. And I think some of his average values got closer to $1. So you see that I think in communicating this, that it's important that we see, and I guess my question was really about, then what do we do? These are, even though things that we can count are conservative, because there's things that we haven't tried to count or are difficult to count. How do you have any suggestions about how we throw that into the decision-making apparatus?
Well, actually, I was going to say, to follow on to the answer to your question, I mean, and how to use the figures here, I mean, the co-benefits, I know this went by pretty fast on the last couple of slides, but, I mean, the co-benefits here, if you reduce electricity generation from, let's say, the randomly chosen coal plant, And the damages, if you did nothing to reduce emissions from the 2005 levels, the damages per, for 1 megawatt hour, which is also 1 ton of CO2, the damages are about $32. Okay, they're 1,000 times 3.2 cents. Okay, so they're $32. So whereas the mean figure from the Nemitz side, or the study that you mentioned, going across different countries and so forth, was $49. Based on our study, it's $32. If that ton of CO2 is coming from coal, if you reduced a ton of CO2 by reducing production of electricity from natural gas, and you'd have to go back 2 megawatt hours to get the ton of CO2, because natural gas doesn't produce as much CO2, the co-benefits there would be 2 times $1.60, they'd be about $3.20. So in other words, it matters where you're reducing the CO in electricity generation, where you're reducing it from, okay? But the numbers in our study would be, in terms of coal, would actually be $32 in contrast to the 49. In terms of whether this is a conservative study and the John Levy study, the John Levy study actually was looking at emissions in 1999 when they were higher than they are in 2005. So part of the damages per kilowatt hour is that on average we were emitting more SO2 per kilowatt hour than we are now, okay? The other reason, though, is that he uses a different concentration response function relating particulates to premature mortality that gives you about 3 times the effect. So if we were to have used that study, the Dockery study, instead of the study we used, the Pope et al. Study, which is used by EPA, if we used the same dose response function as he did, the numbers would go up by a factor of 3. We chose the same dose response functions as EPA uses, actually, and as are in BenMap, which Dr. Patz talked about, that are embedded in that. So we did want to stay, how shall I say it, no, I mean, conservative is perhaps one way to say it, but we chose a method of analysis that coincides with what is currently being done on the regulatory side here.
Please.
From a legislative standpoint, you've spoken a lot about the different benefits and impacts that have the energy policy, coal, carbon transportation. Where would you all recommend sort of carbon gas? Would you recommend energy being pushed more down part and then, cost-benefit analysis changing the electric cars the lack of renewable energy. So, but I understand that there's a major problem transferring energy, make it from solar across the state. So, how would you recommend in a positive way that we sort of sell?
If you don't mind. So thank you for the question, because I think that it's the reality that we find ourselves in. If we take up, for example, the Kerry-Lieberman bill and look at how we're trying to cap carbon, which is admirable, we need to do it. Some of the things that are in the bill are, I think, of concern, because they actually could lead to increased conventional air pollutants. For example, there's a piece in the coal section that talks about if you're going to retire or transition a coal plant, then there would be a task force that would look at all the things that the coal industry faces, whether it's various regulations, exemptions, that could be considered that maybe is a barrier to, from a cost perspective, to transitioning to carbon capture and sequestration. I never use clean coal because coal is inherently dirty. But the important thing to note is that this task force will be able to roll back regulations on because there's going to be recommendations that the DOE, the Treasury, as well as the EPA are obligated to to enforce at least one of them, if not all of them. So that is where we lose our co-benefits, right? So if the Clean Air Act has been successful in saving thousands, if not millions, of lives. And when you can talk about and focus on only one pollutant, for example, CO2, in exchange for other air pollutants that I talked to you about today, there's going to be a lot of losses in that. I think that while we all recognize that coal is part of our future, there's a lot of coal in the United States, and it may be part of our future, what we need to think about is what are the things that we can do efficiently, fast, and will cut down on CO2 and really other pollutants as well. And that is where efficiency, electrical efficiency, as well as renewables come into play. Although you'll see in this climate bill that a lot of emphasis has been put on transitioning to carbon capture and sequestration, which has a very long time lag. We don't have the infrastructure for really getting that CO2 to scale to put down into the ground, and there's a lot of liability issues. This is not a presentation on CCS, but I'd be happy to talk further about that afterwards. Whereas efficiency, the cleanest energy you have is the energy you don't have to generate or you don't use, right? So efficiency really gets us off far away. And in fact, the Rocky Mountain Institute did a report on efficiency and showed that if all the states across the country was doing the same kind of efficiency that 10 of the top states in this country are doing, that would close up about 62% of our coal plants. That's a huge co-benefit on health. So efficiency is very important. Renewable energy is, if you invest and take to scale, you have a 5 to 10 year as opposed to much larger for nuclear, which 50% of those nuclear plants that get started actually never get built. So there's a 50% failure rate on that. And then CCS, which there's a lot of complications around that. So I hope that answers your question.
Okay. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I was going to say, yeah, I mean, in terms of getting down the $32 cost of a megawatt hour from existing plants, I mean, in terms of the local air pollution problem, this is something that, forgetting totally for the moment about climate change, could easily be done by controlling a very small number of plants. And I should say, I suppose, in all fairness, I don't know exactly when these plants would otherwise be retired, but in terms of dealing with that issue, that really is an issue of what are the costs of really putting further controls on those plants. And I think one of the contributions to this study is that independently from EPA, who does its own analyses when, they came out with the Clean Air Interstate Rule of, here are the benefits of the further reductions, we're doing an independent study here. Our benefits don't come out to be quite as high as they did in the regulatory impact analysis for here, but nonetheless, they're really big. And so I think that in terms of reducing local air pollution benefits, it really speaks to doing that.
I think they've answered the question pretty well. I just want to add a few caveats or emphasize a couple things. And in Maureen's report, she mentions they looked at heat for buildings and industrial processes. Well, heat and lighting for buildings is what? Is that 40% of our lighting is 40% of our electrical demand, I think. So just reiterating, like as far as government policies towards conservation as the number one thing to do, saving the demand, reducing the demand, and there's some tremendous gains immediately. And then I think it's been said, distributed sources, biogas, for example, in Germany they have on order of magnitude more biogas plants in agriculture right now. So to have distributed sources, biogas, more natural gas, and one thing about sequestration, if money goes into carbon sequestration, we don't get the health co-benefits. You're sucking up the CO2, and there goes all the rest of the air pollution that harms lives. So carbon sequestration is not something to invest in that would have any health co-benefit.
Most people don't realize that when you do carbon capture and sequestration, you actually have to burn more coal to get that CO2. It takes energy to do that. And so that is more mountaintop removal mining, that's more pollutants. And the majority of our coal plants that we have existing, and about most of those coal plants are about 40 to 50 years old, they are not the coal plants that you can do CCS on. You need to have an IGCC plant. The majority of our plants are not that. So while we have this very large fleet, you're going to have to really do a huge amount of money and retrofit if they can't even be retrofitted. And then you have to actually build the correct plant. That's a little detail that people forget that you need to remember.
Okay, a couple more questions, and since we're kind of close to our appointed hour, if you need to excuse yourself, by all means. But gentleman in the back.
The climate sequestration project you were referring to is coming back to the ground, but what about carbon sequestration to agriculture means or to forestry? Last time I checked, you can sequester carbon through planting trees.
I'm talking two different things,
Okay.
Yeah, let me just, the CCS that I'm talking not so favorably about, I'm talking about coal plant, carbon capture and sequestration. Dr. Patz probably wants to refer to the other one, though.
Regarding carbon capture from vegetation and plantings, there is a study out by Holly Gibbs et al. From Stanford that looks at the carbon in, if we were to have reforestation or plant crops for biofuels, it all depends on where you plant that. For example, there's so much carbon locked up in tropical rainforests or primary forests. If you were to cut down major forests to grow biofuels, you'd actually it would take you thousands of years to just get back to baseline. If you were to grow biofuel crops on degraded land, if you can grow it without fertilizer too much, that's where you get immediate payback. So it all depends on where you plant things. And so this is a study that came out that showed if we were to be really pushing biofuels, but we cut down intact forests, we can go backwards. Yeah.
When you have New York State occurring every year in March, if you replant the forest, which captures CO2 and stores, not used for biofuels, but forest to forest, would that be a more economic carbon sequestration method?
So yeah. Well, this is actually beyond my expertise. I'll just say one thing that I have been told from foresters is that the impression of new growing trees and harvesting them and growing that large trees actually capture and hold on to plenty of carbon, and that it's a misperception to think that, well, gosh, let's cut those down and then grow more and suck up carbon. I don't think I'm exactly answering your question, but it's.
Well, I think there's, as gentlemen understood, there's opportunities in both the agriculture and forestry sector in just in North America, in terms of the bill, and that there's opportunities for enhanced agricultural practices and forest practices to enhance, and I think we should do the same cost benefit. Across the bill, I think this paradigm doesn't fit just health costs, although what we find out is that health costs, when the National Research Council looked at it, became a huge underappreciated quantity.
We're working on a proposal looking specifically at health cost benefits associated with land use planning,
So under
I guess there's a sedimentary gravel, which needs to be reviewed. That's available at all.
So how is the state of the research on in terms of monetizing potential land use planning and community design benefits?
Yeah, that I can't answer for you so readily because I mean it's a harder thing to make the link between reductions in VMTs and changes in land use planning. So all I can say is we do have, you know, from this study we do have, depending on what kind of vehicle you're driving, a cost per VMT, which would of course be a benefit if you reduce the VMTs. By the way, I should say that the transportation part of the study was done at a spatially disaggregated level. So the damages at the tailpipe level vary from, you know, it depends on what county those emissions take place. So even though, you know, on average everything adds up to $1.5 cents or something, it's 25 cents in some areas. I mean, that is one thing when you look at the report, you see that in areas that are more densely populated, these damages really do get much higher. Obviously, the damages from manufacturing are occurring where the vehicles manufacture it or where the oil is being refined. So the benefits do vary a lot depending on where you are, and that you could get out of the study. But the link between land use planning and reductions in VMTs is another important issue, but not one we addressed. Yeah.
Final question.
So, no, if I can just say
go ahead.
very quickly, Grayville et al., that's being resubmitted, and so it's in, you know, so that's why I gave the vague numbers up there. But there are studies published in the journal The Lancet. They came out just last November. There's a whole series on energy and health, and there is one paper specifically on built environment transportation in that paper, in that series. I can send it to you if you need it.
Power sector. I just wanted to make sure that those additional facts made it into the record. That is, in the last 20 years or so, we reduced our sulfur dioxide emissions from 16 million tons to under 6 million tons. Much of that since 2005. And for NOx, we've gone from 7 million tons to 2 million tons. Dramatic reduction in the last couple of years. We implemented the first phase of care. We also reduced mercury about 50% as a co-benefit. We have in the next 2 years being finalized, in the next year and a half, new MAC rules for well hazard fair pollutants. We have higher ozone and SO2 standards and NO2 standards. We go a little further up, but higher PM standards. And we'll have a new replacement for care. So we listed, maybe each mind a little bit. We have dramatically cut emissions. And a bunch of that commission here that was put in the file in 2005.
Okay, General, again, just for the sake of our video record, that the industry has made dramatic strides, both technology and regulation. I think what we're wrestling with going forward here is what can we do in addition to where we are now, what we have, and what are the options? I mean, in some cases, I think some of our panelists may agree that, you know, just retrofits on power plants might be the most economic thing to do, but we're trying to expand the analysis so that we're not doing anything uneconomic, and we're not the opportunity cost of the which is another, you know, when you do one thing, it's your inability to do it all. So with that, the presentations and it will be on our website a little by tomorrow, and the video recording will be up a couple of days later. www.eesi.org. If you didn't sign in, please do, and look forward to your next briefing. And we are going to try and communicate some of this information in a pithy, positive kind of way. So if you have suggestions, we welcome those as well. Chat with us on Facebook, etc. Thank you very much. Please give me a hand for our panel.